At the height of her power, Lauryn Hill had everything the world says you should never walk away from: fame, respect, influence, immortality. One album made her untouchable. One voice changed the direction of music forever. And then, she did the unthinkable. She stopped playing the role. What followed was years of confusion, backlash, ridicule, and judgment. Missed shows. Long silences. Headlines that painted her as unstable, difficult, unreliable. The world didn't just move on, it turned on her. And that's where the darkest secret begins. Because the truth isn't that Lauryn Hill lost control of her career. It's that she discovered something about the industry, and about fame itself, that most artists never admit out loud. Something so unsettling that staying silent was safer than explaining it. Something so threatening that the moment she stopped complying, the narrative flipped against her. This video isn't about rumors. It's about the secret cost of saying no at the top. And what really happens to artists who refuse to be owned. Stay until the end, because once the full picture is revealed, you won't just see Lauryn Hill differently. You'll never look at fame the same way again. Long before the world knew the name Lauryn Hill, there was already a weight placed on her shoulders. Quiet, heavy, and constant. Not the weight of fame, but the burden of expectation. She wasn't raised to be ordinary. From childhood, she was taught to excel, to speak clearly, to think sharply, to represent something larger than herself. That kind of upbringing doesn't create rebels. It creates witnesses, people who see too much too early. Growing up in New Jersey, Lauryn stood out not because she chased attention, but because attention followed her. She sang with intention. She spoke with precision. Teachers noticed. Adults listened. Even peers sensed that she wasn't just talented, she was aware. Awareness, however, comes at a cost. When you see systems clearly, you also see how easily they consume people who don't protect themselves. Before music fully claimed her, acting came calling. Television introduced her to performance as labor, scripts, schedules, direction, hierarchy. She learned early that creativity often comes with supervision, and that expression is rarely free. That lesson never left her. What people misunderstand is this: Lauryn Hill didn't grow up dreaming of stardom. She grew up valuing meaning. Music was not an escape, it was a language. And languages are dangerous in industries that prefer obedience over truth. Even then, before contracts, before charts, before Grammys, there was already a quiet resistance forming. She asked questions others didn't. She pushed back where others complied. Those traits are celebrated in theory, but punished in practice. The crown, when it came, was never going to sit comfortably on her head. When Lauryn entered the world as part of Fugees, it looked like a perfect alignment of forces: intelligence, street realism, melody, and message. The group's rise felt organic, almost inevitable. But behind the scenes, something more complicated was unfolding. Something that would later shape everything. Groups are often sold as unity, but they are built on compromise. Voices compete. Egos negotiate. Power circulates unevenly. From the beginning, Lauryn's presence shifted the center of gravity. Her voice didn't blend, it commanded. Her lyrics didn't decorate, they challenged. That kind of gravity creates tension, especially in spaces not designed to share it. Success amplified everything. As the Fugees gained recognition, unspoken hierarchies hardened. Who leads? Who speaks? Who gets credited? In the industry, these questions are rarely answered fairly, especially when gender and intellect intersect. Lauryn wasn't just a woman in the room, she was often the sharpest mind there. The group's acclaim brought opportunity, but also exposure to the machinery behind success. Labels, branding, image control, these forces circled closer. What looked like momentum felt, to Lauryn, like compression. The more successful they became, the narrower the lane grew. And then there was visibility. Media attention didn't just highlight the music, it magnified personal dynamics, framing them into narratives that were easier to sell than the truth. Complexity was flattened. Conflict was sensationalized. Lauryn learned that fame doesn't just watch you, it rewrites you. By the time the group fractured, many assumed it was about personalities or ego. But fractures don't start at the surface. They start when one person refuses to shrink, and the system refuses to stretch. The Fugees didn't just introduce Lauryn Hill to the world. They introduced her to the cost of being undeniable. Talent gets you noticed. But intellect? That changes how you're treated. When the industry truly locked onto Lauryn Hill, it wasn't just her voice that unsettled people, it was her mind. She wasn't easily managed. She understood contracts. She questioned direction. She spoke in complete thoughts when soundbites were expected. In rooms where artists were supposed to nod, she analyzed. This is the moment the story quietly shifts. The music business is comfortable with genius, as long as genius stays predictable.
Lauryn didn't.
She crossed boundaries between singing and rapping, softness and confrontation, spirituality and critique. She couldn't be boxed without losing the very thing that made her valuable. Executives recognized it. So did collaborators. So did critics. And recognition, in this case, came with fear. Because an artist who understands the system is harder to exploit. Lauryn wasn't rebellious in the loud, destructive way.
Her resistance was calm, measured, thoughtful.
That kind of resistance is far more threatening. It doesn't burn bridges, it questions why they exist. Behind praise and opportunity, pressure mounted. Suggestions turned into expectations. Expectations hardened into demands. Shape the image. Simplify the message. Soften the edges. Deliver what worked last time. But Lauryn Hill wasn't interested in repetition. She was interested in truth. And truth, in commercial spaces, is often treated like a liability. This was the real beginning, not of her disappearance, but of the quiet conflict that would define the rest of her career. The moment she realized that success didn't mean freedom.
It meant negotiation.
And she was already deciding how much of herself she was willing to give away. By the time Lauryn Hill began shaping what would become the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, she wasn't trying to make a hit record. She was trying to untangle herself. That distinction matters. Most debut solo albums are negotiations, one foot in authenticity, the other in market strategy. This one was a reckoning. The songs didn't sound engineered, they sounded confessed. Love was examined, not celebrated. Motherhood was honored without sentimentality. Faith wasn't branded, it was wrestled with. And pain wasn't dramatized, it was understood. The classroom interludes weren't gimmicks. They were warnings. Lessons. Mirrors. They suggested that learning, especially emotional learning, is rarely gentle, and never complete. Lauryn wasn't positioning herself as a teacher above the audience. She was a student speaking out loud. What made the album seismic was not just its genre-defying blend of hip-hop, soul, reggae, and gospel. It was the center of gravity. The record refused spectacle. It demanded listening. In an era that rewarded polish, it offered vulnerability with spine. But here's the paradox no one likes to talk about. When an artist puts their inner life on record that clearly, the world begins to feel entitled to it. The album didn't just succeed. It validated her instincts, and that validation became a trap. Because now, the industry knew exactly what to ask for next. More of you.
More access.
More pain, packaged the same way. The masterpiece didn't liberate Lauryn Hill. It raised the stakes. The night the awards came, history was written in bold letters.
5 trophies.
Standing ovations. A coronation few artists ever experience. The room cheered as if witnessing destiny fulfilled. But destiny is loud.
Protection is quiet.
Winning big at the Grammy Awards didn't come with a manual for survival. It came with expectations disguised as honor. Suddenly, Lauryn Hill wasn't just an artist, she was a standard.
A benchmark.
A reference point others would be measured against. And benchmarks don't get to rest. Public praise creates private pressure. Interviews multiplied. Appearances stacked up. Everyone wanted a piece of the moment. Everyone wanted her explained.
What does she represent? What does she stand for?
Where does she go next? But those questions assume the artist exists to answer them. Behind the applause, something subtle began to shift. Decisions that were once collaborative became assumed. Creative freedom turned conditional. The unspoken message was clear: repeat the miracle. Yet miracles, by definition, don't repeat on demand. What made the night historic also made it isolating. The higher she was placed, the fewer people spoke to her as a human being. Admiration replaced dialogue. Celebration replaced care. And with every accolade, the distance between Lauryn and the machinery around her widened. Success didn't feel like arrival. It felt like exposure. She had reached the summit, and discovered there was no shelter at the top. This is where the myth usually begins, the idea that success insulates artists from harm. That once you make it, the struggle ends. But applause does not protect you from exhaustion. Awards do not shield you from control. And reverence does not equal safety. In the months following her rise, Lauryn Hill began to pull inward, not dramatically, not publicly, but instinctively.
She spoke less, questioned more.
Observed the patterns forming around her life. Schedules filled without consent. Creative suggestions arrived framed as obligations. Personal boundaries blurred under the excuse of opportunity. The same industry that praised her honesty now asked her to perform it on cue. This is the moment many artists break, but quietly. Because breaking doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like saying no in a world that only rewards yes. What people misread as arrogance was often caution. What critics later called instability was, in many moments, discernment. Lauryn wasn't rejecting success. She was questioning its terms. She had given the world an album that spoke from the deepest parts of her life. And the world responded by asking for ownership of that depth.
Applause, she learned, is conditional. It loves the result, not the cost.
And somewhere between the cheers and the contracts, Lauryn Hill began to understand a truth that would shape everything that followed. To stay visible, she would have to disappear from herself. And that was a price she was no longer willing to pay. When people talk about control in the music industry, they often imagine it as obvious. Contracts, clauses, signatures. But for Lauryn Hill, control arrived in quieter, more corrosive ways. It came disguised as guidance. After her solo breakthrough, conversations around her work subtly changed tone. Questions were no longer "what do you want to say?" but "how do we deliver it next time?" The shift was small, almost polite, but decisive. Her art was no longer treated as a living process, it was treated as a product line. Ownership became the silent battlefield.
Who owned the sound?
Who decided the pace? Who defined what a Lauryn Hill record was supposed to be? Expression by nature is fluid. Ownership, by contrast, demands repetition. The industry didn't want evolution, it wanted replication. The same emotional access. The same vulnerability.
The same rawness.
Over and over again, on schedule. But Lauryn understood something many artists don't realize until too late. When your most intimate thoughts become your most profitable asset, they stop being yours. Creative meetings became negotiations. Personal boundaries were reframed as obstacles. When she resisted being molded into a reliable formula, concern replaced celebration. Is she difficult? Is she drifting? Is she still focused? This is how pressure becomes invisible. There are no threats, only expectations. No ultimatums, only disappointment. The message is clear without being spoken: compliance equals support. Lauryn didn't reject structure. She rejected surrender. And in an industry built on ownership, that distinction made her dangerous. There is a moment in many artists' lives when refusal becomes a turning point.
Not a dramatic walkout. Not a public statement.
Just a simple, firm no. For Lauryn Hill, that word carried consequences. She declined appearances. She delayed projects.
She questioned timelines.
To the outside world, these choices looked erratic. Internally, they were acts of preservation. But systems rarely distinguish between the two. In creative industries, productivity is often mistaken for wellness. Visibility is treated as proof of stability. When an artist steps back, the narrative quickly fills the silence. And silence in this business is interpreted as failure. The language around her shifted again. Private turned into reclusive. Selective turned into unreliable. The refusal to perform on demand was reframed as inability. What made this especially dangerous was how easily the story spread. Fans repeated it without context. Media echoed it without curiosity. Industry insiders benefited from it without accountability. Once an artist is labeled difficult, everything they do is filtered through that lens. Missed shows stop being logistical.
Delays stop being human. They become evidence.
Lauryn wasn't pushing against one decision or one contract. She was pushing against an entire expectation that her time, her energy, her emotions were perpetually available. And in saying no, she crossed an unspoken line. Because the industry tolerates rebellion only when it can be monetized. Quiet refusal? That's unforgivable. By now, the distance was visible, but misunderstood. Lauryn Hill hadn't vanished. She was still creating, still thinking, still writing. But she had stepped outside the constant performance loop that defines modern celebrity. And without that loop, the public didn't know how to place her. Isolation doesn't always mean loneliness. Sometimes it's the absence of distortion. Lauryn withdrew from spaces where every word was interpreted, every gesture analyzed, every pause judged. She limited access not because she feared people, but because she understood the cost of being endlessly consumed. To observers, it looked like retreat.
To her, it was clarity.
Yet isolation has a consequence. When you're not present to defend yourself, others define you. Stories calcify. Assumptions harden into facts. The absence of explanation becomes the explanation. Fans began to ask where she went. Critics asked what went wrong. Very few asked what she might have chosen. And that's the irony at the heart of this chapter of her life. Lauryn Hill was never more intentional than when people assumed she was lost. She wasn't disappearing. She was stepping out of a system that required her to fracture herself for access. And in doing so, she set the stage for the most misunderstood era of her life, one that would transform private decisions into public judgment. When Lauryn Hill began speaking more openly about faith, many people assumed it was a phase, another reinvention, another aesthetic turn. But that assumption missed the point entirely. This wasn't branding. It was reorientation. Faith didn't enter her life as an accessory. It arrived as a boundary. For Lauryn, spirituality wasn't about performance or proclamation. It was about authority, whose voice mattered most. And once that hierarchy shifted, everything else followed. The metrics that once governed her decisions, charts, sales, approval, lost their power. Not because she rejected success, but because she rejected being ruled by it. That shift made people uncomfortable. Faith, when it can't be packaged, disrupts control. It doesn't move on schedules. It doesn't respond well to deadlines. And it doesn't ask permission from industries built on predictability. Meetings grew strained. Expectations clashed. The same people who once praised her depth now questioned her focus. Is she still marketable? Is she still reachable? The concern wasn't subtle, it was systemic. But for Lauryn, faith wasn't an escape from responsibility. It was a recalibration of responsibility. To whom did she owe her energy? Her time? Her voice? Choosing God over charts wasn't a declaration, it was a quiet decision that rewired her priorities. And in an industry that treats devotion as distraction unless it sells, that choice marked her as incompatible. Motherhood didn't slow Lauryn Hill down. It redirected her. In a culture that celebrates endless output, choosing to center children is treated like abdication. Especially for women. Especially for women at the height of their power. The question is never what are you gaining? Only what are you giving up? For Lauryn, motherhood sharpened her awareness of time. Every hour spent touring, promoting, performing was an hour taken from something irreplaceable. And once that realization settled in, the math no longer worked. The industry doesn't account for this kind of calculation. It offers accommodations only when productivity remains untouched. Anything else is framed as decline. But Lauryn wasn't declining, she was deciding. She refused to fragment her life into public triumph and private absence. She wouldn't outsource presence. And she wouldn't accept the idea that legacy required sacrifice at home. This decision came with a cost. Opportunities thinned. Patience evaporated. Support cooled. The unspoken rule became clear: you can be a mother, or you can be omnipresent, but not both. And so the narrative shifted again. She wasn't just difficult now. She was wasting her potential. What that accusation really meant was simpler and crueler: she was no longer willing to be endlessly available. Perhaps the most radical thing Lauryn Hill ever did was refuse to turn her wounds into a renewable resource. Audiences loved her honesty, but only in retrospect. They wanted pain delivered cleanly, rhythmically, on schedule. They wanted healing compressed into verses. What they didn't want was an artist who said, "I'm still in it. I'm still figuring it out." Lauryn refused to perform pain on command. She wouldn't reenact past trauma for applause. She wouldn't repeat emotional moments just because they once resonated. And she wouldn't pretend clarity where there was still process. That refusal unsettled people. Vulnerability is celebrated only when it's consumable. When it becomes ongoing, unresolved, human, it's labeled unprofessional. So the distance widened. Appearances grew rarer. Expectations hardened into resentment. And the public, trained to expect access, interpreted restraint as defiance. But what if restraint was the point? What if refusing to bleed publicly was an act of self-respect? This chapter of Lauryn Hill's life isn't about loss. It's about boundaries. And boundaries, especially from women in power, are often punished more harshly than mistakes. She wasn't hiding her pain. She was protecting it. By the time the word difficult began trailing Lauryn Hill like a shadow, it had already hardened into something more permanent than rumor. It became a shortcut, a way to explain complexity without engaging it. Difficult is a useful word in entertainment. It absolves systems of responsibility. It reframes resistance as personality. It turns boundaries into defects. Once the label sticks, everything confirms it.
A missed appearance? Proof. A delayed project? Evidence. Silence? Guilt.
What rarely gets examined is who benefits from this framing. When an artist is called difficult, expectations lower. Accountability shifts. Negotiation disappears. The system no longer has to ask why, it only has to point. For Lauryn, the label didn't emerge from chaos. It emerged from friction.
From saying no.
From refusing to meet timelines that conflicted with her values. From questioning arrangements others accepted quietly. But nuance doesn't survive headlines. Media stories simplified her into a cautionary tale, brilliant but unstable, gifted but unreliable. The complexity of her choices was flattened into pathology. Her discernment was recoded as dysfunction. And here's the most damaging part: once the narrative takes hold, the artist's own voice becomes suspect. Any explanation sounds defensive. Any correction sounds erratic. Silence is taken as confirmation. So Lauryn did what few people in her position could do without imploding. She stopped trying to correct the story. Not because she agreed with it, but because she understood its function. Nothing cemented the public's judgment more than the performances that didn't go as planned. Late arrivals.
Rescheduled shows.
Sets that didn't align with expectations. Each incident became a data point in a growing case against her.
Fans felt disappointed.
Promoters felt frustrated.
Critics felt validated.
But what the public saw as inconsistency was, in many cases, conflict beneath the surface, logistical breakdowns, creative disagreements, spiritual hesitation, emotional exhaustion. None of it glamorous. None of it easily explained in a tweet or headline. The modern audience expects polish. It expects reliability. It expects the artist to arrive fully formed, every time, regardless of circumstance. What it rarely tolerates is humanity that interferes with delivery. Lauryn's silence during these moments only intensified the backlash. In an age of constant explanation, choosing not to speak is interpreted as disrespect. But silence for her wasn't avoidance, it was refusal to reduce complex realities into digestible excuses. The crowd wanted reassurance. The industry wanted compliance. The media wanted confession. She gave none of it. And so the story grew louder without her. Each retelling stripped away context. Each reaction hardened opinion. The artist who once commanded reverence was now discussed as a problem to be managed, or a legend to be mourned. Few stopped to ask whether the expectations themselves were unreasonable. Fewer still considered that the silence might be intentional. Then came the moment when everything collapsed into a single, devastating headline. Legal trouble has a way of eclipsing nuance. When Lauryn Hill faced charges related to taxes, the story finally found something concrete to latch onto. Something that could be framed as failure without interpretation.
For many, this was confirmation.
The last piece of the puzzle. The proof that decline wasn't just artistic, it was personal. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. The case wasn't about extravagance or fraud-driven excess. It was about disorganization, mistrust, detachment from systems she had long felt alienated from. It was about someone who had already stepped away from the machine being punished by it. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Sympathy was scarce. Context was irrelevant. Years of artistic contribution were condensed into a verdict. What went mostly unexamined was how predictably this moment arrived. When an artist disengages from infrastructure without building an alternative, consequences follow. Not because the system is malicious, but because it is indifferent. It does not pause for spiritual reckoning or personal redefinition. The legal storm didn't expose Lauryn Hill's darkest flaw. It exposed how eager the world was to finalize her story. To turn a complex life into a warning label. To mistake consequence for character. When consequences arrive publicly, they're often framed as moral lessons. In the case of Lauryn Hill, accountability quickly became spectacle. The legal outcome was treated less like resolution and more like validation. Confirmation that the narrative had been right all along. Headlines didn't ask how this happened.
They asked what it said about her.
Complexity collapsed into certainty. The system had spoken, and many were ready to listen without question. But justice, in practice, is rarely neutral. Punishment landed on someone already living outside the mainstream machinery. Someone who had stepped away from the buffers that quietly protect constant participants. The message was unmistakable: disengagement does not equal immunity. You may leave the stage, but the system still claims jurisdiction. What went mostly unaddressed was proportionality. The intensity of the response contrasted sharply with the way similar cases were often treated behind closed doors. Visibility amplified consequence. Reputation amplified judgment. For Lauryn, the experience was not a collapse, it was clarification. The distance she had created from the industry was no longer theoretical.
It was final.
The separation was no longer symbolic.
It was enforced.
And yet, even here, she did not plead for sympathy. She accepted responsibility without surrendering dignity. She did not rewrite herself to regain favor. She endured. Punishment, in this case, did not restore order. It exposed how little mercy the system offers those who refuse to play by its rhythms. Return is a word that implies restoration, things going back to how they were. But when Lauryn Hill reappeared on stage, it wasn't a return. It was a re-entry on new terms. The performances were different.
Less predictable. More raw. Sometimes uneven. Sometimes transcendent.
They reflected a life lived, not a brand preserved. And audiences didn't always know how to receive that. Some came seeking nostalgia. They wanted the exact voice, the exact pacing, the exact emotional architecture they remembered. What they encountered instead was an artist who had changed, and refused to pretend otherwise. This unsettled people. In a culture that treats artists like time capsules, growth feels like betrayal. But Lauryn wasn't interested in reenactment. She was interested in presence.
In honesty.
In showing up as she was, not as she was remembered. Criticism followed her back onto the stage.
So did devotion.
Some fans walked away disappointed. Others leaned in deeper. The divide said less about her and more about expectation. Because what she offered wasn't polish, it was truth in motion. The road back was never about reclaiming status. It was about reclaiming agency. Each appearance was a reminder that she still belonged to herself first, and to the audience only second. Few legacies are as contested as Lauryn Hill's. On one side stands the myth, the prodigy who burned too brightly and vanished. On the other stands the work, timeless, influential, undiluted. Between them is a woman who refused to resolve herself into something easily summarized. Legacy usually rewards consistency. It prefers output over intention. It values visibility over principle. Lauryn Hill challenged all of that by existing out of sequence, by appearing when she chose, speaking when she felt compelled, and withdrawing when alignment disappeared. That makes people uneasy. Cultural memory wants closure. It wants arcs that end neatly. Rise, peak, fall, or fall, redemption, triumph. Lauryn's story refuses those shapes.
It stretches. It contradicts. It resists simplification. And maybe that's the point.
Her influence didn't disappear with her absence. It multiplied quietly, through artists who learned that vulnerability could be strong, that intellect could live inside melody, that refusal could be an act of integrity. The debate over her legacy isn't really about her choices.
It's about ours.
About whether we value artists as producers, or as people. About whether we allow growth without punishment. About whether we can honor brilliance without demanding access to it forever. Lauryn Hill's legacy isn't unresolved.
It's unfinished.
By the time the culture decided Lauryn Hill had gone silent, she had already been speaking for years, just not in the places people were trained to listen. Silence in celebrity culture is treated as absence. But silence can also be refusal. Refusal to explain yourself to people who aren't listening. Refusal to compress lived experience into palatable quotes. Refusal to turn an evolving inner life into a public service announcement. Lauryn spoke through choices. She spoke by declining to chase trends. She spoke by appearing when alignment existed, and disappearing when it didn't. She spoke by letting inconsistency expose the lie that artists are machines. But because she didn't narrate those choices in real time, others narrated them for her. That's the danger of stepping out of the performance loop. The moment you stop providing commentary, the commentary fills itself in. Silence becomes interpreted as confusion, arrogance, instability, anything except intention. What most people missed is that Lauryn was deeply engaged, just elsewhere.
With her children. With her faith.
With her own interior life. With questions no chart position could answer. The culture mistook privacy for absence. It mistook process for decline. It mistook restraint for failure. Lauryn Hill wasn't silent. She was simply unwilling to keep explaining herself to an audience that only accepted one version of her. And that refusal may be the most articulate statement she ever made. So here is the darkest secret, the one teased, misunderstood, and endlessly speculated about. It is not scandal. It is not madness. It is not failure. The darkest secret is far more unsettling than any rumor. Lauryn Hill saw the machine clearly, and chose not to belong to it. She realized early what many artists realize too late: that success often comes with conditions incompatible with wholeness. That the industry rewards openness only when it can be scheduled. That it celebrates authenticity only when it can be repeated on demand. And that women especially are punished not just for mistakes, but for boundaries. Lauryn refused to split herself into versions: public and private, productive and human. She refused to monetize every wound. She refused to sacrifice presence for permanence. And she refused to apologize for choosing a life that made sense to her, even when it disappointed everyone else. The cost of that refusal was steep.
Reputation, momentum, ease, belonging.
But the alternative cost more. What unsettles people isn't that Lauryn Hill struggled. It's that she walked away without asking permission. In a culture obsessed with output, she chose alignment. In an industry addicted to access, she chose limits. In a world that demands performance, she chose truth, even when it was messy, unfinished, and inconvenient. And maybe that's why her story still provokes debate. Because it forces a question we rarely ask honestly. What do we do with artists who don't collapse, but also don't comply? Lauryn Hill didn't disappear.
She stepped aside.
And in doing so, she left behind not a cautionary tale, but a mirror.